All right, thank you very much. All right, as you heard, my name is Thomas Wahl. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Construction Engineering, and I'm also a member of the UCF Coastal team. As you mentioned, as you have heard earlier, it's the second time that I'm presenting here, so I tried to switch things up a little bit in terms of the content, but obviously a few things haven't changed. I'm still from Germany, where I got my degrees in civil engineering, was a postdoc at UCF College of Marine Science, a Marie Curie Fellow of the European Union in the UK before I joined UCF in spring 2017, where I've been since then directing the Coastal Risks and Engineering Lab. You can see here our funding portfolio is relatively broad. Multiple federal and state agencies are supporting our work that happens at the interface of coastal engineering, physical oceanography, hydrology, climate science, and so on. I'm teaching hydrology and hydraulics at the undergraduate level, and at the graduate level, I developed a coastal systems analysis class, which I'm actually offering this fall in case you have any students who might be interested to join that class. Some key achievements listed here at the bottom, early career awards from some of the scientific societies, EGU and IAPSO, and I received the NASA Early Career Award in 2018, and then more recently the NSF Career Award, and that's one of the things I want to talk about a little bit more today. My work, one part of my research is heavily focused on anything that's related to sea level and sea level rise. So when you go to the beach and you look at the water levels that you see is made up of many different things, many different components. There is the mean sea level, which is the base water level, and that is rising. So when we talk about sea level rise, we talk about how mean sea level slowly but steadily increases. On top of that, we have tides that come in and go out once or twice a day, depending on where you are on the planet. We have surges, storm surges, as we are very aware in Florida, and extreme waves, which can lead to extreme flooding events, but also to beach and dune erosion. And all of these components interact. They have certain spatial temporal characteristics, and that's what we try to understand to help improving coastal design approaches and support coastal adaptation in the face of climate change. The second big topic that my group is working on is centered around this broad field of compound weather and climate extremes, which is illustrated here for the example of compound flooding. Compound flooding can happen when multiple flooding drivers, such as rainfall or a storm surge, happen at the same time, and they compound each other, and that leads to more impacts as any of these drivers would cause if they would occur in isolation. So if we had just a storm surge or just the rainfall event. So in general, these compound events are events where multiple climate drivers or hazards combine to contribute to societal or environmental risk. Now, this is a figure that I showed last time on my last slide, where I mentioned that my work had mainly focused on these aspects here at the top, the climate change drivers. But if we really want to understand coastal risks and develop adaptation options and adaptation pathways to mitigate negative climate change impacts, then we need to integrate that with many other things, socioeconomic development. There's a lot of policies that need to be taken into consideration regarding land use, for example, water management. Land subsidence is a big problem in the northern Gulf of Mexico, for example, because of oil and gas extraction. So land is subsiding even faster than sea level rises. So that again compounds each other. Here in Florida, we could add red tide problems to the list, flesh-eating bacteria in our coastal waters and things like that. So that makes it very complex. And when I showed this slide last time, I mentioned that one new NSF program that looked really interesting was the NSF COPE, the Coastlines and People program. And not long after I presented almost 2 years ago, I was contacted by colleagues who were assembling a team to develop a proposal for this COPE NSF program. And we developed the proposal for the Megalopolitan Coastal Transformation Hub, which NSF calls a large-scale hub. It's a highly interdisciplinary team. We have 12 institutions. It's a 5-year project. It was funded and started last year in fall. It's $20 million, of which $1 million is coming to UCF to support the work that my group is doing for this particular project. The main goal is to develop climate resilient decision-making frameworks for coastal communities with the important aspect of equity at the center of pretty much everything that we do. That is something that this COPE program really focuses on. So we are basically operating in this relatively narrow space here in the middle, where we as researchers have our own research agenda, our research program. We have the funding agency that wants certain things, and NSF is very specific about what they want in this Coastlines and People program. And one thing that they want is to have stakeholders engaged from the get-go. So it's this whole idea of co-development of knowledge. And that means we are now in this narrow space here as a transdisciplinary research design with this new project. And this is how the project is organized. We have obviously people from climate science, sea level science, engineers here in this hazards group. We have political scientists, economists, geographers, social scientists involved in the project in these other groups, and we are interacting closely with them and especially with stakeholders, and that's what we are doing right now. So it was interesting in this case that, for me, relatively new, we wrote this proposal. We were very vague in terms of what we would do in terms of the actual science. We said, okay, we would focus on compound extremes. That's why they asked me to be involved. Climate change impacts, decision-making for coastal communities. But because the decision makers, the stakeholders, are the ones who should drive actually the direction of the research, we couldn't be too specific. And our engagement team has now spent the last 6 months or so conducting hundreds of interviews with, I think, 40 initial candidate study sites in New Jersey, which we have now narrowed down to a handful of candidates. And I just received this morning another 60-page document from targeted engagement, which has taken place over the last couple of weeks. Now we are tasked to review this 60-page document until next week to further narrow down which decision problem we really want to focus on. And it might end up being related to combined sewer overflows. It might be related to port retrofitting. It might be related to re-engineering dunes, wetlands, and oyster reefs to mitigate storm surge impacts. That's something we don't really know yet, which made it really hard to recruit students and postdocs for this project because they couldn't really tell them exactly what they would be working on, and they had to cast a very wide net. Importantly, we only focus on communities with high proportions of marginalized and vulnerable populations because of this equity aspect that I mentioned before. So we won't look at places like Manhattan, where a lot of funding is already going. And we will then repeat the same process for New York, and we will have a slow track shortlist. So some of the decision problems that we may not select now for more detailed assessment may still be looked at later on. Once we have identified the decision problems that we want to focus on, which we know will be related to climate change, and it will be in a coastal setting, we want to follow this dynamic adaptive policy pathways approach, where we have multiple options on how to adapt to future climate change impacts. We have a pretty wide portfolio of solutions at our disposal, but some of them work better for certain climate change scenarios than others. So the question that we need to ask is, which options do we have, under which climate change scenarios are they effective, and how long does it mean that they are likely effective? For example, a solution that works pretty well under relatively low sea level rise scenarios may fail if sea level rises faster than what we currently anticipate. And then we need to have this flexibility to switch to a different pathway. So we have to be aware to not, or be careful not to be locked into a certain path from the get-go, which may then fail down the road depending on how climate change plays out. So that is a very interesting experience for me to be part of this interdisciplinary team, and very different type of approach to research that we usually take, and very applied, which is also quite unusual for NSF, but I think they are, at least the programs that I'm looking at, are transitioning a little bit more into this applied direction. Another thing I mentioned last time when I presented in the end was that I wanted to work on a career proposal, which I then did and submitted it last year. And it was selected for funding and already started in January because they needed to spend money very quick. This career proposal focuses on the spatial temporal clustering of storm surges. The spatial part, when we hear about the storm surges coming to Florida, there's a hurricane coming, there are storm surge warnings, we are usually just concerned about what happens to our house, or at least mainly concerned about what happens to our house. So we're all sitting there and looking at, are we inside or outside the cone of uncertainty? How far away is the track from where I live? But of course, these storm surges have a much wider spatial footprint. These storm surges are caused by storms which follow typical tracks. And that means that these footprints also are not unique. So there's a lot of spatial dependency going on, which, if we understand it properly, can help us answer questions like, if there is a storm surge affecting the port of Tampa, what is the chance that the same storm surge also affects the port of Miami or the port of Jacksonville? From a DoD perspective, we could ask, what's the likelihood that multiple DoD installations, multiple Navy installations along the coast are affected simultaneously by a storm surge, which then becomes pretty quickly a matter of national security. So understanding these spatial footprints is one aspect of this career project. The other one focuses on temporal clustering, which means back-to-back impacts. We had hurricanes Maria and Irma affecting Puerto Rico within just 2 weeks of each other in 2017. We had hurricanes Marco and Laura at some point being forecasted to make landfall within, I think, just 48 hours in pretty much the same location in the northern Gulf of Mexico, which in the end luckily didn't happen. But if these back-to-back impacts happen, then usually smaller events that happen later in time that would usually not cause any problems suddenly lead to severe impacts and loss of life, because flood defenses are already weakened and communities are still in the period of recovery. And based on historical data analysis, as part of the proposal, we were able to show that there is this tendency of storm surges to cluster in different periods of time. And that's what we try to understand, and then integrate both the spatial clustering and the temporal clustering into flood risk assessments and coastal adaptation planning. Some research objectives listed here on the right. Of course, first identify these spatial clusters and temporal clusters, and I'm just showing results here for a few locations. We will do that globally, everywhere along the global coastline. We want to explore how these clusters may change due to climate change and climate variability. Very importantly, we want to develop statistical frameworks which allow us to model these extreme events. So we are looking at the tail of the distribution here, while capturing the spatial and temporal dependence at the same time. And then finally use that information to see how these clusters affect humans and the built environment. The project is funded under the HDBE program from NSF, the Humans, Disasters and Built Environments program. Research plan, near term, I want to expand this idea of compound climate and weather extremes, going beyond just flooding, which has been our main focus in the past. We're already doing that a little bit in an ongoing project with the national academies. We have a project that got recommended for funding, a proposal from the Florida EPA, where we could use the same framework and apply it to health impacts. We are talking to colleagues at the RISES cluster and preparing a proposal with them where we would use, again, a similar framework, but apply it to energy infrastructure, specifically looking at how PV systems can help make the energy infrastructure more resilient against these extreme events, and also working on another proposal for DOT to apply it to transportation infrastructure. The next 3 bullets show you that I'm getting a little bit more serious about getting DOD and ONR funding. There have been a couple of calls because they are now really picking up this climate readiness idea and want to focus on future climate change impacts to their installations. So that links very well to the work that we have done in the past, and those are pretty large multi-million-dollar proposals as well. Expanding industry partnerships, that's something I have ignored for a very long time, but more recently we have been contacted a lot by larger consulting firms who are now tasked to also include future sea level rise, compound extremes into their work when they develop integrated water management plans, for example, for coastal communities. And they don't have the expertise to do that, and that's a chance for us, I think, to collaborate with them. And finally, we had another COPE proposal under review with our UCF coastal team that was a focused hub that got pretty good reviews, but didn't quite make the cut. So that's something that we definitely want to revise and resubmit at some point. In the long run, I'm in the process of trying to establish longer-term partnerships with some institutions, the Water Institute of the Gulf, for example, the Army Corps of Engineers. We are very interested in these long-term partnerships. They are very interested in these long-term partnerships, which would be a very consistent funding stream. So hopefully we will be able to set that up. And in the long run, I also would really like to get involved in these larger center proposals, which again, there's a lot of lobbying involved, a lot of political games involved. So you really have to play the long game, I think, if you want to be successful. But at the end of the day, it can pay off. such as the University of Alabama, my colleagues there at the Water Institute, they just received 360 million from NOAA over 5 years. So those are the kind of large-scale proposals that I really would like to work on a little bit more in the long run. This is my group here at UCF, PhD students. 2 more are joining us in fall, hopefully, if they get their visas sorted out. I have 5 postdocs at the moment, and in that regard, I can't highlight enough how important the P3 program has been to me to ramp up my research program here. All of them started as P3 postdocs. Many of them have since then supported or funded themselves. And when we talk to our partners at Princeton and Dartmouth about project stuff, and I mentioned the P3 program, that's really something they get very jealous about. So I hope this program will continue in the future. And that's it. Thank you very much.